On Father's Day weekend, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother, his father, and his grandfather headed up to the Smoky Mountains to go camping. This was a family tradition on Father's Day, and they were really excited about it. They get to the same campsite they always used. They set up, they have a wonderful first night, they camp out, and the next day, another camper in the area happened to walk by and saw that Dennis and his brother were playing there. And so this camper had kids as well, and he asked Dennis's father, hey, would it be okay if I brought my kids by? They're the same age as your sons, and they can just play together. Dennis's father says, sure, bring them down. And so the man goes, gets his kids, they come back, and before long, all the kids are playing hide and seek. Now, Dennis's father would say that he had an eye on Dennis the whole time. He was just at a distance, but watching his son to make sure he didn't get lost. And so at one point, all the kids are hiding from the parents. And, at some point the parents say, okay, show yourselves. And all the kids, except for Dennis, show themselves. And Dennis's father has watched Dennis go behind a particular tree. He watched him do it. He was watching the whole time. And so when they said, come on out, and he didn't come out, he actually wasn't that concerned because he knew exactly where his son was. And then after a few moments, he yelled to his son directly and starts walking over and says, Dennis, come out, Dennis. I know you're behind the tree. And when he finally got over there, Dennis wasn't there. Dennis's father immediately starts running off into the woods, screaming for his son. And he actually ends up running almost 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, just hollering for his son, and he can't find him. And then the rest of the family had broken up and was searching the area because they're thinking, like, he couldn't have gone very far. He was literally just here. And Dennis's father had said before, like, I watched him go behind the tree. I watched him. I don't know where he is, but I watched him go behind the tree. And so they're searching everywhere, and Dennis is gone. So a huge search, in fact, the biggest search in park history, ensues with 1,500 searchers that included the Army Green Berets, so the special forces got involved. They are combing a 60 square mile plot. They're looking everywhere, and there is nothing. There is no trace. There's no scent. There is nothing connected to Dennis Martin anywhere. And so they go back to Dennis's father and they're like, you have to tell us what you saw. Again, this doesn't add up. If you were looking at the tree and he was right there, how is it that he has just vanished into thin air? But no one knew. That was it. No one knows what happened. There's no closure. He's just gone, and they never knew what happened to him. Years later, when David Paulides was doing his research for Missing 411 and was researching the Dennis Martin case, he interviewed other families that had been at the campground at the same time that Dennis had gone missing. And one of those families was the Key family. And they had asked a park ranger where they could go on the campground where they might be able to see some bears. And so the park ranger obviously said, be careful, but you can go over here to this section of the campground and you might see a bear. And so they head over there and they're looking for bears. And one of their children hears a scream, or thinks he hears a scream, and kind of directs the family to look in the direction of the scream. And from their vantage point, they could see up onto the side of this mountain where there was, call it sparse trees all over the mountain, so you could kind of see in between the trees. And they saw what looked like a bear running along the mountainside, but with something slung over its shoulder. Except the interesting thing about this bear was the father was quoted as saying that it didn't really act like a bear. It was acting more like a human the way it was running. It looked, hairy and like an animal, but it was running and dodging between trees. It was holding this, what looked like a child over its shoulder. It acted almost like a human. And so you have a bear man that has been spotted by the Key family, and they bring this up to the investigators that are looking into the Dennis Martin case. And, obviously the Dennis Martin investigators, they don't take this seriously. They think that they're just, saying some ridiculous thing for attention or whatever it is. So, it never really was entered into the case with Dennis Martin. It wasn't until the Missing 411 cases that it was ever connected. But there really was a family that claims to have seen a bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin had gone missing in the same area where Dennis Martin had gone missing. In the spring of 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkkins was playing with his siblings outside of his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. And when the kids were all called in to have lunch, Keith was nowhere to be found. And so the siblings and the family went out and did a cursory search looking for Keith. And when nothing turns up, they call in authorities and a full-fledged search is launched for Keith. There's no sign, there's nothing. And 4 miles away from the ranch, they find several hours later some footprints that look like they might belong to a 2-year-old. And they start tracking those footprints and they go on for miles and miles, and then they just kind of stop. And it wouldn't be until the next day, 12 miles away from the ranch, that they would ultimately find Keith. Surprisingly, Keith, who had disappeared with not enough clothing to be out in sub-zero temperatures with snow on the ground and being 2 years old, he wasn't prepared for a night out. He was found alive, face down, 12 miles away. His jacket and his hat had been stacked neatly next to him, and he had scratch marks all over his face, but he was unhurt. When asked, what happened, he's 2 years old, he had said a cat scratched him, and he kept repeating that a cat had scratched him. That was the only thing that he could articulate. No one knew how a 2-year-old, in the span of 20 hours, could have moved in the middle of the night 12 miles away. Les Stroud, who's a very accomplished outdoorsman, he's the star, he is Survivor Man, he actually, because of this case, went out and tried to actually cover the distance in the allotted time. You have 20 hours to cover this 12 miles, and he couldn't do it. And he even said, it's not possible for a 2-year-old to have covered this distance, let alone survived the exposure to the elements in the time that he was out there. But somehow he did. And, years and years later, Keith was interviewed, because now he's a grown man, he was interviewed about what happened, and he has no idea, he has no memory of it. At the end of 1973, 19-year-old Charles McCuller, who was an amateur photographer, had been doing a West Coast tour of the United States, going to all the different national parks to photograph beautiful scenery. And by January of 1974, he was in Oregon and wanted to go to Crater Lake, where he wanted to take pictures of Crater Lake. So he asked his friend, who had an all-terrain vehicle, to take him out to Crater Lake, because his van, which was this VW beat up old van, it couldn't have made it out that far. And as his friend is driving him out to Crater Lake, Charles says to him, kind of jokingly, if you don't hear from me in a couple of days, file a missing person report. And sure enough, a couple days later, when Charles doesn't show up, that friend does file a missing person report, and an extensive search is conducted at Crater Lake to find Charles. There's no sign of Charles. There's nothing. There's no anything about Charles. And his father actually flew out there and stayed for several months, just constantly searching the area, found nothing. So nothing is found. So a year later, a couple of backpackers were hiking the area around Crater Lake, and they get lost. They take a wrong turn, and they're well off the trailhead, and they discover a backpack. In the backpack, they found a strange-looking Volkswagen key that anyone that knew Charles McCuller knew that he had this strange key. And so when they found it, it was a distinctive key. And so when they gave it to police, it turned out that it was Charles McCuller's backpack. So investigators went out and started looking in the area that this backpack was found, which was 12 miles off the trailhead. So this is well off the trailhead. And near the backpack, they find what remained of Charles McCuller. So they found his pants unbuttoned and on a log, as if he was sitting on the log and then just disappeared into the ground, but his pants were still there. Sticking out of the pants were his socks, no shoes, and in the socks were his feet bones. There was no jacket, there was no upper portion of his skeleton. 12 feet away, they find a portion of his skull, and that is the last thing they find of Charles McCuller. And ultimately, it was determined that he died of natural causes. His family was not prepared to accept that, however, when you look at some of the circumstances. We have, he's missing his jacket, he's missing his boots, he's missing his photography equipment, his head is detached from his body. He was also 12 miles off the trailhead, and when he went missing, there had been approximately 5 to 7 feet of snow that had dumped in the area. So how did he move 12 miles off the trailhead in 7 feet of snow, especially when you consider he was not an outdoorsy type, and even when he got dropped off by his friend that drove him out there, he even said later on that he felt like Charles was very ill-equipped for the environment he was going into. But at the end of the day, it was left as, sorry, he went missing and he died of natural causes, and that was that. Bart Schlider was a famous outdoorsman and hunter. He was just one of those people that you could drop into any environment and he's not only going to survive, he's going to thrive. A testament to that would be he spent months in Siberia tracking and catching Siberian tigers. He was like a world-renowned tiger tracker. He's just like this super rugged, super competent outdoorsman. In September of 2004, Bart books a float plane to take him 175 miles north into the Yukon Territory in Canada for him to go hunt moose on his own for 3 weeks. He had all the right equipment, he was obviously extremely capable, and no one thought twice about it. When he got dropped off, he told the pilot, "Meet me back here in 3 weeks." And so off he went. The plane leaves and comes back 3 weeks later, and there's no Bart. Now, the pilot knew Bart was like a god in the wilderness, and so he wasn't really concerned, but he went over to where he had been told his campsite would be, and he found the campsite, and it looked like someone was still living there. It didn't look like it had been destroyed at all. And then near his campsite, he found a dry bag, which looked like it had an indent on it where someone might have been sitting on it up against a tree. And then next to the tree was his bow and some arrows. And it looked like an area where a hunter might have been sitting to call in moose, but there was no Bart. Near the dry bag and the bow and arrow, they found Bart's teeth and a couple of shards of bone. Initially, the thought is, well, a large predator must have snuck up on Bart and eaten him. Except there's a couple of huge problems with that theory. One, Bart, his friends at least would say, and people that knew him would say, he would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness. Like, he was always a step ahead of everything around him. So the idea that he would just be sitting there one day and a bear would just happen to sneak up on him is pretty far-fetched. Also, in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. There's no marking on the ground or in the surrounding areas that a large predator had attacked him. Also, his camp had food out in the open, and if a large predator had come through like a bear, after it finished with Bart, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that, because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't really add up. In 2002, Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew that was working in Harris County, Georgia. And they were walking along this road spaced about 50 feet apart, all 4 of them. And Chris was the last one in line. And the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he would periodically turn around to just, for a quick second, make sure Chris was still there. And as they're walking along with no sound or any indication that anything's happened, he turned around, saw Chris, kept walking. A few minutes later, turned around, and Chris is gone. The third guy hails the other 2, and they go, and they're like, "Where did Chris go?" They're looking down the road, like maybe he stopped, maybe he stepped off the trail, but they can't see him. And they go back they start walking down the road towards where he would have been, and they find on the ground a pile of loose change and some of his tools that would have been in his pockets. And then they see one of his boots stuck in the barbed wire, because there's a little barbed wire fence that was running the length of this road. One of his boots was stuck in the barbed wire, and there was nothing else. They searched the area, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign of him, and it didn't make any sense to the people in the survey crew, especially the guy who was third in line, who was like, "I literally saw him a minute ago, and there's no way he could have gotten away without me hearing or seeing some indication of where he was." But there was no sign of him, and he was gone. So after this huge investigation, they don't find any sign of him, and that's it. They're just like, yeah, he's gone. They did find, 9 months later, they found his other boot near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity into what happened to him. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that at some point he may have been turned upside down. And if you think about the entirety of all of these strange stories, where the idea being someone could be hunting humans, just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute where no one can see where they went. These 5 stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of others that are covered in the Missing 411 series. And while many people believe that all of the cases in Missing 411 and any others that ultimately are considered strange inside of these national parks have a rational explanation, even if we don't know what it is. Whereas another group believes that this Missing 411 phenomenon is an indication that something is hunting humans in the national parks across North America. Some say Bigfoot, some say aliens, some say something else. But paranormal is certainly the other camp in terms of trying to explain away. So this first one really takes the cake for just being strange. You have a family that basically has 2 experiences that are somewhat connected. You're gonna have to be the judge if they're connected or not, but very strange. On October 1st of 2010, this family, who decided to remain anonymous for the Missing 411 story, they go camping, and it's a 3.5-year-old boy, his older sister, and then the mom and the dad. And so they go camping at Mount Shasta in California, which is a popular camping site. And the family loved to go camping there. And so they're all sitting around the campfire, kind of hanging out at the campsite. It's getting late in the evening, maybe 5, 6 o'clock. And the sister would say that she was looking at her brother, turned away for a second, and then looked back, and he was gone. And it was so sudden that she actually went to go look for him and couldn't find him. So she went and told her mom and her dad, and they start calling for their son, and they're looking all over their campsite, and he's gone. Authorities show up, and they launch a full search. And for 5 hours, they have hundreds of people scouring this area, not only the campsite, but the surrounding areas, and there's no trace of this boy. 5 hours later, they find him laying in a thicket on a trail that had been searched multiple times. And it wasn't like hidden. The thicket was like right by the side of the trail. So if you've searched this trail, you've found this kid. So meaning he couldn't have been there during the search. He must have arrived and then they found him on this trail. Everybody was so happy that they found this kid and he wasn't physically harmed that no one really looked into the fact that it doesn't make any sense that he is here. How did he get here? Where did he go? Where has he been? No one thought about that. They were like, we got the kid back. We're all happy. The parents are happy. Everyone's ready to just move on. And so the kid goes to the hospital. The doctor looks at the kid and says, you know what, he's fine. This is obviously a traumatic situation, but he's fine. You can take him home. And so the kid goes home with his parents, and pretty quickly the family went back to normal. They were obviously super grateful that they didn't lose their son. About 3 weeks after this whole ordeal, the boy is with his grandmother, who he called Cappy. And he looks at Cappy and he goes, I don't like the other Cappy. And so his grandmother, the real Cappy, she looks at him and she was like, what do you mean? Now, remember, this is a 3.5-year-old boy. Language skills, not the best, okay? But this story that he tells his grandmother, he had previously told his father, but the father had written it off as the ramblings of a 3.5-year-old. It wasn't until the grandmother told the father about the story that he was like, I've heard that story. And so the boy says, while he was camping, he turned and he saw Cappy waving to him to come with him. And so he loves Cappy and he goes with Cappy, and Cappy leads him up a hill to a cave. Now the whole time, the real Cappy, who wasn't there, she was not with them camping. She's thinking, oh my God, someone who looks like me abducted this child. So she's listening, horrified. He said, she brought me up to a cave. And when we got into the cave, he said there were spiders and purses, like women's purses. And he turned to look at Cappy, and he said that her head was glowing. And it was when he realized this is not Cappy. This is the other Cappy. And he said the other Cappy kept asking him questions, but he didn't know the answers. And so the other Cappy got frustrated and told him to leave and pushed him out of the cave. And he said that he left the cave and wound up in the thicket, and that's when he was found. And so when Cappy goes and tells the father, and the father says, I've heard that story, they're like, that's so weird. Do you think there's any truth to this? Is there someone that looked like me, Cappy, that took the boy away? And so as Cappy and the boy's father are talking, Cappy feels compelled to share her own strange story about being on Mount Shasta, because prior to this, the family, I think the way they were looking at what happened is the boy wandered off and he returned 5 hours later. But with the boy's story being kind of corroborated by, the father who heard the same story, Cappy's like, I got to share my story now because I don't know if it's connected, but I had a very strange experience on Mount Shasta as well a year ago. She went camping a year earlier with her friend, and they go to a campsite on Mount Shasta, the same place where the boy disappeared, and apparently saw the other Cappy. And so Cappy says that night they're sitting around the campfire and it's dark, and she notices a set of eyes in the woods that were glowing. So glowing red eyes, she says. And Cappy and her friend, they go camping all the time. And so they know there could be predators and animals all over the place. And so they grab their flashlights and they shine in the direction of the eyes, and the eyes dart away and they don't think anything of it. Over the course of the night, the eyes would keep showing up all around them. And every time they'd shine a light in their direction, they would vanish. Cappy and her friend are unable to get the light on this thing. So they don't know what it is. And so they're very uneasy about it. But they decide, you know what? We're psyching ourselves out. It's just an animal that's interested in us. And so they go to bed and they sleep in their own. She slept in a tent and he slept in a camper, and they go to bed. And the next morning, Cappy wakes up and she's laying on the dirt outside of her tent. And immediately she has pain in the back of her neck. And so she reaches back and she grabs her neck and she can feel there's a cut on the back of her neck. She doesn't know what it is, and she looks up and her friend is on the ground outside of his camper face down as well. And so she gets up, she feels horrible, like sick, like violently sick in fact, and she kind of staggers away over to her friend who is laying there, and she can see too that he's got a mark on his neck, and he gets up and he's like, what happened? And they assumed that they had been bitten by, a poisonous spider. That's actually what they believed, because it was a little puncture wound on both of their necks, and that it had caused them to be sick and delirious. They'd wandered out of their camper and their tent, and they'd wound up on the ground. But now, as Cappy is retelling the story, she was like, I don't know how to connect that experience with what happened to the boy, but I can't help but feel like something weird's happening on Mount Shasta. And it would turn out that, maybe they weren't wrong, because Mount Shasta is like a hotspot for missing 411 strange disappearances. And in fact, our next story is another Mount Shasta case. In 1999, Carl Landers was a very experienced hiker, climber, whose passion in life was, on the weekends or any chance he got, was to go hiking and climbing and camping. That was just what he did. He was in great shape. He was enjoying retirement. That was his happy place, is being on a mountain somewhere in California, hiking around. And he had two very close friends that he would go hiking with just about every chance he could. In 1999, in the summer, Carl decides he wants to summit Mount Shasta. And it's something he had attempted to do before, and he had been unsuccessful, and this time he was going to do it. And so Mount Shasta, it's high enough, it's about 14,000 feet, that it's not uncommon for people to stop at this point called Lake Helen, where hikers can adjust to the altitude, because it's certainly possible to get sick from being at altitude if you don't adjust to it, or if your body doesn't respond well to it. And so their plan was get to Lake Helen, camp out for the night, and then summit the next day. So they head up in May of 1999, the three of them. They get to Lake Helen and they set up their camp for the night. It was clear that Carl already had some sort of altitude sickness, because by the time they reach Lake Helen, he's weak, he's sick, and he figures, I'm gonna try to sleep it off tonight. I'll see how I feel in the morning. And so all night, Carl is just super sick. It's a horrible night for him. And so early the next morning, Carl, he's a real stubborn guy and he really wanted to climb Mount Shasta. He says to his two friends, hey, look, I'm just gonna get a head start here. I've been up basically all night. I'm gonna just get up the last stretch here, summit this mountain, and then come back down and be done with it. And so his two friends, they didn't like the idea of splitting up, but Carl's an experienced guy. And I mean, he's only covering a distance of maybe 650 feet. Like, this is not some epic distance he's covering. It's basically like a day hike. So Carl leaves on his own. He leaves his backpack at the campsite, and his two friends would watch him as he kind of bent around the mountain and went up towards the summit, and that would be the last time they ever saw him. The two friends would attempt to summit as well about 30 minutes later. One of them apparently had gotten sick overnight and said, look, I can't do this, and he stays at the camp. He's like, I'll be here. we've already split up from Carl. Why don't you also go on your own, summit yourself, and I'll be here. I'll wait for Carl. I'll wait for you. The friend that does make the summit, he goes up, he follows the same trail, this short distance up to the summit, gets to the summit, and he hasn't seen Carl. He's not shocked. It is a little strange that they wouldn't have passed on the way, but he's thinking, anything could have happened. Maybe he sat down somewhere, I don't know what it is, and then comes back down expecting to see Carl back at the campsite. So he gets back to the campsite at Lake Helen where the other sick friend had not left. He was still there. And he says, hey, has Carl come back? And the friend's like, no, didn't you see him on the way up? Did you lap him? Like, what's he doing up there? And he's like, no, I went up. I didn't see him on the way up. I didn't see him at the summit, and I didn't see him on the way down. And they're thinking to themselves, like, thinking about the trail itself. It's incredibly open. There's almost nowhere to like fall. There's no crevasse. There's no sheer cliff. There's almost no vegetation really to obscure you. It just didn't make any sense that you could vanish. A huge search is launched. They never found anything. There was also 50 to 100 people in the area that day, and nobody knew where he went. No one saw him. No one had any idea what happened to him. They interviewed everybody there. No one knows what happened to Carl. The only clue that we have of Carl is the backpack that he left at Lake Helen before he made the summit run. Other than that, for 20 years, we have no clue what happened to him. None. So this next story is really creepy. One of the strange phenomenons that you get inside of these missing 411 stories is you have people that go missing really suddenly, like as if they were pulled away at high speed and just ripped off the face of the mountain. And this story is one of those stories. In 2010, Eric Lewis was 57 years old. He was an extremely experienced mountain climber, and he had two very close friends that were also very experienced mountain climbers. And they decided that they wanted to go hike Mount Rainier in Washington State, which is a huge mountain. And they were doing a climb that was fairly technical and fairly dangerous, and it required the three of them to be tethered together on the same cable. And so as they're making this ascent of Mount Rainier, you have friend one in the front, friend two in the middle, and then Eric Lewis is the third guy on the line all the way down. And so the way it worked is the first climber, friend number one, if he wanted to rest, the other two climbers would keep climbing up to his position and take a rest with him. So he was kind of in charge of setting the cadence of how quickly they were going to climb this mountain. And so over the course of the day, the first climber would stop periodically, and then the second climber and Eric would make their way up and wait and relax. All day that was happening. And then one time they come to a stop, and there's been nothing weird happening. Nothing's happened to this point. Everything feels very normal. The first guy stops, the second climber gets up to him, and then Eric doesn't show up. And so they pull on the line, and it's very light. And they pull it up, and the rope has been cut. Like, Eric's gone. And they're like, okay, only in an emergency would you cut the line. And so they just start immediately descending because they're like, well, it just snowed. It'll be very easy to track his footsteps. If he cut the line, he must have had a reason. Let's follow his footsteps to wherever he went. But the only footsteps on the mountain were the ones walking up, attached to the rope. Basically, Eric had been walking up, leaving footprints right behind the other two, and then the footprints just stop. There aren't footprints that go back down. It was like he was pulled off of the mountain. And so they start walking down thinking they're gonna run into him, but they don't. The weather gets bad enough that they ultimately abandon the hike. They go down and they're like, geez. They tell the authorities and they're looking everywhere and they can't find him. And then they discover this creepy cave that's like 200 feet down and away from where they were hiking. That would have been very hard to get to. Inside of this ice cave is Eric's gear, but no Eric. And they've never found Eric's body. But for that gear to get into the cave, it wasn't just, hanging on the edge. It was inside the cave. But there was no footprints leading to the cave. There's no footprints anywhere. It was just like inexplicably, Eric's gear winds up deep inside an ice cave 200 feet away, and Eric's body was never recovered, and no one has any idea what happened to him. So the last story is actually really two distinct stories, but they together make up a particular phenomenon that occurs inside some of these missing 411 cases. And that's when some creature takes a child and actually protects them. In 1868, a 3-year-old girl vanished abruptly from her father's camp in northern Michigan. The father noticed the girl was gone. In hysterics, he enlists the help of a couple professional hunters that were there with him. They go off looking for this girl, and after a couple of hours of looking, they start to hear what sounds like her voice. And she doesn't sound particularly distraught, but it's definitely a child's voice. And so they kind of cut through this big thicket, and out bursts this massive bear-looking thing that runs away from them. And they didn't shoot it or anything. They just saw this huge animal run away, and they're thinking the worst, because they're hearing this child and now they're seeing this huge animal that looks like a bear running away. And they go through the thicket and they find this girl who's totally unharmed, who was in this kind of clearing within the thicket where clearly this bear creature had been with her. And the father's elated. He scoops up the child, and the child seems unhurt, and he asks her, like, "Where have you been? What happened?" And she says, "Oh, Mr. Wolf took me here. And Mr. Wolf was feeding me berries, and Mr. Wolf was playing with me." Maybe it was a bear or a wolf or something, but some animal had taken her, brought her into a thicket, and had not harmed her. And so the other instance occurred in 1955 when a family that was made up of mother, father, and their 8 kids were staying in this camp in Montana. And they had all these different tents set up for all their kids. And some of the older kids were staying in one of the tents with their 2-year-old sister, Ida Mae, while the parents were working and the kids were doing whatever they were doing. And so these older kids are sitting deep inside the tent, and near the entrance to the tent is where Ida Mae, the 2-year-old, is sitting. And the tent is open, like the flap is open to the tent. And as they're sitting there, the older kids would later say that a bear wandered past, reached in, grabbed Ida Mae, and scooped her up into its arm. Now, a bear does not do this with its arm, but they described it like this. The bear was holding Ida like this and ran away on 3 legs instead of 4. And so the kids are freaked out because they just saw a bear take their 2-year-old away. They're basically hysterical. They sprint up to their mom and dad. They tell them what happened. And the parents just have no idea how to react to this. They obviously get in touch with authorities. They launch the search. And as they're doing the search, police are asking the kids, like, describe to us again what you saw. And they're like, it was a bear that was like holding our sister like this. And they were like, you got to be more descriptive because bears can't do that. Was it a person? Was it a hairy person? And the police just didn't buy that it was a bear. And so 2 days go by and they haven't found this child. And so the family obviously is thinking the worst. They're absolutely grief-stricken. And then one of the searchers finds the girl. And they find her about 300 yards away from the camp. She was inside of a very intentionally built structure. It was like a crudely built fort. Right against the riverbed. And inside it was like a den, and she was in there and she was totally unharmed and she was perfectly fine. And they take her out and they ask her, like, what happened? And she's 2, but she says, "Mr. Bear fed me berries. Mr. Bear kept me here. Mr. Bear cuddled me." That's all we have. We don't know what this creature was, what bear is able to pull its arm in like this, but she felt totally unthreatened by it. And to this day, we don't really know if that was a bear or something else, but whatever it was, it didn't harm Ida, and Ida never felt threatened by it. These stories...
12-year-old Adrien Martinez smiled as he pedaled his bike through his dusty neighborhood in Socorro, Texas, on a hot September day in 2005. School was scheduled to open for the fall the next morning, but Adrien was free as a bird today as he cruised the streets of this small city on the Mexican border. If Adrien was being honest, he was pretty excited to start 8th grade. He was a good student with lots of friends, and he loved playing sports after school. Besides, much as he loved summer vacation, the long, hot days could actually get pretty boring. Adrien was already thinking about what he was going to wear for the first day of school. As Adrien rounded the corner onto a street, he waved to a group of boys playing basketball in their driveway, and he also stopped to pet a neighbor's dog. Adrien had always lived in Socorro, Texas, and he felt like he knew almost everybody there. This truly was his home. Adrien skidded to a stop outside of his family's modest home, where he lived with his mother, whose name was Maricela, and his 3 siblings. Adrien was the oldest boy, and his father was not in the picture, so he and his mother were very, very close. And in a way, Adrien sort of felt like he was the man of the house. Adrien knew that his mother was having a really hard time right now. She didn't have a job, and so supporting him and his siblings was really hard. But at least she didn't have to worry about Adrien. He did his best to make sure of that. Adrien laid his bike down in the front yard and ran to the house, taking the steps to the front door 2 at a time. The next morning, Adrien woke up full of excitement and rushed to the bathroom. He'd woken up early to make sure he could claim the shower before his siblings could come out and create a bathroom traffic jam. But when he was toweling off, Adrien began to notice this weird burning sensation in his right leg. As he looked at his leg more closely, he realized the pain was coming from the pink birthmark that ran from his ankle all the way up to his hip. Adrien had always had this mark, but it had never hurt before, so he just kind of shrugged it off and wrapped the towel around his waist and then wandered out to the kitchen to tell his mother. But when his mother kneeled down and gently pressed her palm against her son's leg, she quickly pulled her hand away and looked up at Adrien with concern. His leg felt weirdly hot, as though only this part of his body was running a fever. Adrien's mother stood up and told her son they would get his leg checked out after school. For now, she just rushed him to his room to go change. He'd be late to class if he didn't hurry. That day, after school, Adrien sat on the edge of a doctor's exam table, swinging his legs back and forth. He felt the cold metal of the stethoscope on his chest as his pediatrician, Dr. Andrews, listened to his heart. Adrien shifted in his seat as Dr. Andrews wrapped an itchy cuff around his upper arm to take his blood pressure. Maricela gave her son a sharp look and reminded him to sit still. Then Dr. Andrews told Adrien to lay back on the table and roll up his right pant leg. The physician gently touched the birthmark, and immediately Adrien squirmed. It didn't exactly hurt when the doctor touched him, but it was uncomfortable. Dr. Andrews would confirm that Adrien's leg was still warm, but besides that, it didn't seem like anything was physically wrong with him. He told Adrien and his mother that this was likely just growing pains, because Adrien was starting to go through puberty. The doctor said it was not uncommon for boys to have these mysterious aches and pains as they grew into men. 4 months later, Adrien was out in the street throwing a football back and forth with his buddy Sam, when as he went to go catch the ball, he suddenly realized he couldn't run very well. His right leg suddenly felt heavy, like it was stuck in mud. Adrien had been playing football with his friends every Saturday since seeing Dr. Andrews, and up until today, everything with his right leg had been totally fine. His birthmark on his leg still did burn a bit, but it wasn't too bad. So Adrien told Sam that he had to go home now because of his leg, but he'd see them next weekend. Then he slowly made the short walk down the street back to his house. And once he got home, he went up to his room and he took off his pants, and when he looked in the mirror, he was totally startled at what he saw. His right leg looked significantly bigger than his left leg. For a second, Adrien was terrified, but then he remembered that his doctor, Dr. Andrews, a few months earlier had said this was no big deal and he had nothing to worry about. And so despite what he was seeing in the mirror, Adrien told himself he was just fine, and then he walked away from the mirror, trying hard to forget what he had just seen. A few weeks later, in February of 2006, Adrien hopped on his bike and began riding to school like he did most mornings. But this time, something just felt wrong. As Adrien pedaled down the street, he felt his right leg bump up against the frame of the bike. He also realized that his jeans on his right leg felt unbelievably tight. Adrien slowed to a stop and looked down at his legs. And immediately he could tell through his jeans that his right leg had ballooned in size overnight. He'd never seen it this swollen. But again, Adrien told himself that his doctor said it was fine, so he pushed the thought away and tried to pedal his bike again. But now it was impossible because of how swollen his leg was. Every time he tried to turn the pedal, his right leg really pushed hard against the frame, and it really hurt. Adrien didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't go to school like this. So he stepped off his bike, turned around, and began pushing it along next to him towards his house. And as he walked home, the pain in his right leg was so extreme, he had to fight hard to keep tears back. A couple of weeks later, Adrien sat next to his mother in the doctor's office with his right leg extended out in front of him. It was now so big, it was hard for Adrien to even bend his knee. They were waiting for his latest round of test results. Socorro, Texas was a small city that didn't have that many doctors, but Adrien felt like he'd seen every one of them in the last few weeks. They'd run every test they could think of. Adrien had multiple x-rays, MRIs, and CAT scans done. The doctors hadn't told Adrien or Maricela what exactly they were looking for, but so far, they hadn't found anything. Adrien hoped this new doctor would have some sort of answer for him. All he wanted was for his leg to go back to normal so he could play football again and ride his bike again. Just then, Adrien heard the door handle rattle, and Adrien's latest doctor walked into the room carrying several pieces of paper. The doctor looked down at the papers, then spoke to Adrien and his mother. On the positive side, the doctor said that Adrien did not have heart disease, kidney failure, or a host of other very serious conditions. But the doctor said he had to admit that he didn't know why Adrien's leg was swollen, and so he didn't know how to make it stop. So the doctor ultimately advised Adrien and his mother to just kind of leave the leg alone and let it heal on its own. Adrien couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been watching his leg grow bigger and bigger for almost 6 months, making it nearly impossible for him to do more and more everyday things. Why couldn't the doctors figure out what was wrong? A few months later, Adrien was sitting in class when the bell sounded to signal the end of the period. Students sprang out of their seats, rushing out of the classroom, but Adrien just sat there and waited for the crowd to thin. Then, when they were all gone, he braced his hands on the desk and pushed himself up to stand with a grunt. As soon as he began to walk, he felt a shooting pain in his right ankle, and he nearly fell over into a table. It had been months since Adrien had seen that doctor that said, just wait this out, but clearly his leg was not getting better. It was just getting worse. By the spring of 2006, his right leg was nearly double the size of his left leg. It looked like the leg belonged to a totally different body. Adrien had started wearing these really baggy jeans in an attempt to hide his right leg, but all his classmates knew, and they were not shy about teasing him. As Adrien limped out of the classroom, he felt the students in the hallway shift their gaze to his leg. Some pointed at him and whispered or giggled as Adrien's cheeks burned red, but right now, Adrien's biggest problem was not embarrassment. It was the pain in his ankle. The sheer weight of his right leg was now so enormous, it felt like his foot was going to collapse with every step. Adrien gritted his teeth and kept his head down as he walked past all the students who were laughing at him, and he made his way to the nurse's office. Once he was there, he asked to make a phone call, and when he called his mother, he did his best to keep his voice steady as he told her she needed to come pick him up right now. About an hour later, Maricela stood in the emergency room, anxiously watching as a flurry of doctors and nurses surrounded her son. She stayed by Adrien's side as he was put in a wheelchair and rushed him from one exam room to another. Once again, the doctors took x-rays and CAT scans and MRIs. They measured the diameter of his right leg and compared it to the information Maricela had given them about how much it had grown. They listened intently as Adrien explained all of his symptoms. Maricela thought this actually seemed different from all their other doctors' visits. Like finally now, these doctors were taking Adrien's issues really seriously. Maricela hoped this was the turning point that Adrien had been waiting for, and that the medical team would finally be able to figure out what this was and then help her son. After spending much of the day at the hospital, Maricela brought the car around to the front entrance to pick up her son. A nurse wheeled Adrien outside, and Maricela helped him out of the wheelchair and into the passenger seat. She squeezed Adrien's hand as they pulled out of the driveway. They'd be back here in 3 weeks for the test results. For now, all they could do was hope for the best. After a long 3 weeks, Maricela and Adrien were back at the hospital to go over Adrien's test results. Maricela sat next to her son in the exam room, her hands clammy as they waited for the doctor. Maricela could also feel the anxiety radiating off of Adrien as he quickly flipped through a book, no doubt just trying to distract himself. Finally, the door opened and the doctor strolled in. He sat down in the chair opposite from the mother and son, and he glanced down at his clipboard before turning his gaze to Adrien. In a calm tone, he told Adrien that the good news was that they did have a diagnosis and it was not life-threatening. These last few weeks, Maricela hadn't dared speak the words out loud to Adrien, but secretly, she worried her son had cancer or some other deadly disease. So to hear this was not life-threatening was just such a relief. But Maricella's sense of relief lasted only about a second, because the doctor then told Adrien that he had something called elephantiasis, which is a rare disorder that causes the lower half of the body to thicken and swell. He explained that when someone has elephantiasis, the natural fluids that surround all the tissues in our bodies get blocked and begin to build up. And in Adrien's case, it was affecting his right leg, causing it to swell and become huge. Maricela turned to her son and asked if he was okay, but instead of answering her, he just looked at the doctor and asked if they could fix it. The doctor took his glasses off, set them down on his knee, and with a solemn look on his face, he told Adrien, unfortunately, there was no cure for this. If they'd caught it when Adrien was younger, they could have given him medicine that might have stopped his leg from swelling, but now there was no way to reverse it. Adrien's leg would never go back to its normal size, and the only thing he could do was wear compression stockings to reduce the discomfort. Maricela watched as her son's lip began to quiver, and then tears began to well up in his eyes. She wrapped her arms around her son and began to smooth his hair back. The doctor excused himself to give Maricela and Adrien some privacy. He said he was so sorry he couldn't be more helpful. After the doctor was gone, Adrien looked up at his mother and he told her that he wasn't sure if he could keep going to school with his leg looking like this. He was going to get bullied constantly. Maricela was thinking the same thing, but she told him it would be okay. They'd find a way to make school more comfortable for him. She said she would do whatever she could to support him. Adrien leaned on his mother's shoulder as they slowly made their way out of the hospital towards their car. Then they drove in silence all the way home. Three years later, Adrien slowly limped into class, mouthing the word "sorry" to his teacher, Mr. Perez. Adrien was used to arriving late for pretty much everything by now thanks to his leg, which only continued to grow. Now, as a junior in high school, his leg was nearly triple the diameter of a normal man's thigh, and it weighed about 150 pounds all by itself. Adrien's leg was so big, he couldn't even fit it in a normal wheelchair anymore. Teachers let Adrien leave his class 10 minutes early to give him extra time, but he was still almost always late to his next class. Some teachers got annoyed, but Mr. Perez didn't mind. Adrien hobbled to the back of the class, wincing as he took his seat. He was still a good student, making great grades and participating in class, but that was partly because, by this point, schoolwork was pretty much the only thing Adrien could do. He couldn't play sports, and he didn't hang out with his friends anymore, and he barely left the house except to go to class. And now, Adrien had yet another problem. Seemingly overnight, a swath of itchy pimples had sprung up on his leg. And so he wriggled in his seat, trying to find a more comfortable position, when suddenly he felt something burst on his right leg. Adrien looked down in horror as he saw a wet stain begin to seep through the fabric of his jeans. And then an awful smell wafted up to his nose. One of Adrien's new pimples had burst, and it smelled disgusting, like rotten eggs, but even worse. Adrien carefully glanced around the classroom, seeing if anybody else had noticed yet. Mr. Perez stood up in front, writing math equations on the whiteboard. Most of the other kids were copying down notes, but the students right in front of Adrien, so near the back of the classroom, they began swiveling their heads around to face Adrien while wrinkling their noses. As the smell fanned out towards the front of the room, more and more students began to notice. They started looking around, pinching their noses with their fingers, and muttering about not being able to breathe. Adrien stared down at his desk, unbelievably mortified, not daring to make eye contact with anyone. Every time Adrien thought he could not be more humiliated by his leg, there was always a new low, and this was it. It was bad enough that everybody made fun of him because of how big his leg was, but now his legs smelled bad too. Adrien hung his head in shame and began counting the seconds until he'd be able to leave school and go back home. Later that week, Adrien struggled out of his jeans in an exam room at a dermatologist's office. As he did, Adrien scrunched up his nose in disgust because, without his pants sort of masking the smell, the odor from his right leg now overpowered the room. Adrien wrapped a disposable gown around his waist, and then sat down in the exam chair. After a few minutes, Adrien heard a knock at the door, and the doctor entered the room. He gave Adrien a big smile, and he asked what brought him in today. Adrien tried to match the doctor's upbeat energy, but he couldn't bring himself to smile. Instead, he started talking about the itchy pimples on his leg. After Adrien finished explaining, the doctor said, "Okay, let me see your leg." And so Adrien slowly reached down and pulled aside his gown, revealing his swollen, pimple-covered leg. And it was obvious the doctor was really caught off guard by what he was seeing. But after the initial shock wore off, the doctor kind of composed himself and then told Adrien and Maricela that he'd never seen such a big leg before. Adrien immediately looked over at his mother and stifled a groan. He was looking for help from this doctor, not to be treated like some science experiment or circus act. Finally, the doctor slipped on some latex gloves and leaned in for a closer look. And after a few minutes of poking and prodding, the doctor explained that these were not pimples on Adrien's legs, but instead they were pus-filled blisters. And unfortunately, he didn't know what was causing them. Then he reminded Adrien to make sure he was taking regular showers to keep his leg clean. Adrien suddenly wished the reclining chair he was on would just swallow him whole, so he didn't have to sit here while the dermatologist lectured him about taking showers. Usually, the doctor's office was the only place Adrien did not feel self-conscious about his leg. But thanks to this dermatologist, even that was no longer true. A few days later, Adrien was back at school, sitting in Mr. Perez's class. Mr. Perez could see that Adrien looked absolutely miserable. He knew Adrien's leg must be impacting his quality of life, but the teacher didn't know much about Adrien's situation beyond what he observed in class. The teacher wasn't one to get involved in his students' personal lives, but something in Mr. Perez told him this was an unusual situation where maybe he could make a difference. So instead of letting Adrien leave his class early like usual, Mr. Perez actually asked him to stick around after the bell rang. And then once the bell rang and the other students had left the room, Mr. Perez made his way to the back of the class where Adrien was sitting nervously waiting for him. Mr. Perez quickly reassured Adrien that he was not in trouble. He explained that he noticed Adrien looked really upset and wanted to make sure he was okay. For a few moments, Adrien sat in silence, looking down at the desk. And when he looked up, Mr. Perez could see his eyes were full of emotion. Before long, Adrien told Mr. Perez the whole terrible story of how his leg had grown more and more deformed for years, and no doctor seemed able to do anything to help. It was like Adrien had been waiting for someone to ask him what was wrong, and now the floodgates were open. Later that week, Mr. Perez sat next to Adrien in the school library, scouring the internet for information on elephantiasis. Adrien had explained his diagnosis and how there was no cure, but Mr. Perez figured there had to be something they could do. The pair had been meeting in the library during their lunch periods to use the school computers to see if maybe the doctors had missed something. As Mr. Perez read through another medical article, Adrien, who was right next to him, began laughing at a video of a dog riding a skateboard. Ever since they'd started coming to the library, Adrien had seemed happier. Mr. Perez suspected that Adrien hadn't had a friend for a long time. Mr. Perez turned back to his computer, where he had a tab open to elephantiasis symptoms. He read through the list in a hushed voice, verifying each one with Adrien, and as Mr. Perez read on, they realized something strange. Adrien had some of the symptoms of elephantiasis, but other symptoms, such as persistent coughing and chills, were way off. And so a strange thought crossed Mr. Perez's mind. Maybe Adrien did not have elephantiasis. Maybe he had something else entirely. Later that night, Mr. Perez was home, working at his desktop computer. He couldn't stop thinking about the discovery he and Adrien had made at lunch. So he created a new document in Microsoft Word and started typing out all the other types of diseases that could cause a person's leg to swell up as much as Adrien's had. One by one, he compared the list of symptoms for each disease to the symptoms Adrien experienced. And when they didn't match up, Mr. Perez would cross the potential diagnosis off his list and keep on going. After several hours, Mr. Perez was bleary-eyed but determined, and his list was shrinking. He took a sip of coffee, and then he clicked on a disease that he had never heard of before. As he read through the symptoms, his heart began to race. He couldn't believe it. This condition sounded like a perfect fit to what was going on with Adrien. Now he just needed to find an expert that could help. The reality was, Socorro, Texas was a small community without many medical resources. So Mr. Perez knew they would not be able to get Adrien the specialized care he needed here. So Mr. Perez searched the web for experts in this disease he had identified all over the country. And after digging through hospital directories and online forums, he came across a doctor in New York who might be able to help. 2 weeks later, Dr. Robert Rosen sat down in his oversized desk chair after a long day of surgeries and patient consultations in his busy New York office. He surveyed the stacks of letters and paperwork that littered his desk, and he sighed. He doubted he'd make it home in time for dinner. He leaned forward and began rifling through the documents when he noticed a large manila envelope peeking out from under a cluster of papers. Dr. Rosen pulled out the parcel, surprised by how heavy it was. The return address was in Texas. Curious, the doctor ripped open the seal and spread the contents out in front of him. His eyes grew wide as he took in the slew of medical records and test results. Then he saw the photograph of Adrien Martinez and nearly fell out of his chair. In his 30 years as an endovascular surgeon, Dr. Rosen had only seen a handful of cases like this one, and none were this severe. The photo showed Adrien sitting on a couch with his right leg extended. The boy's leg took up practically the entire sofa. It was full of folds and crevices and absolutely massive. There was a letter from Adrien's mother explaining that her son desperately needed help. The doctors in Texas had diagnosed Adrien with elephantiasis, but it just didn't seem right. Her son wasn't getting any better, and now she worried for his life. Dr. Rosen looked back over the medical records, and sure enough, he saw that Adrien had been diagnosed with elephantiasis. But just as Adrien's mother and Mr. Perez had suspected, that diagnosis was definitely wrong. Dr. Rosen grabbed the photograph again and studied the pink mark that now covered the bulk of Adrien's right leg. That was it, the doctor thought to himself. That birthmark was the key. A few days later, Adrien huddled with his mother at the kitchen table, anxiously waiting for their phone to ring. They were expecting a call from Dr. Rosen any minute to discuss what was really wrong with Adrien's leg. When the phone finally rang, Maricela jumped to answer it, putting the phone on speaker and placing the phone on the table in front of her and Adrien. Dr. Rosen introduced himself, and Adrien immediately began to relax. He'd been waiting for this moment for years. Whatever happened next, at least Adrien would get some answers. Dr. Rosen started by telling Adrien that he did not have elephantiasis. He never did. Instead, Adrien had a very rare condition called Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome, or KTS. The same disease Mr. Perez had suspected from his internet research. He explained that KTS is something you're born with, and what it does is it causes the blood vessels in someone's arm or leg to warp and twist, which makes it hard for blood and other fluids to be distributed properly throughout that limb. In Adrien's case, the blood and fluid had pooled in his right leg, causing intense swelling. And it started happening when he hit puberty because sometimes hormonal changes act as the trigger for KTS. Dr. Rosen said that KTS can be hard to diagnose because it is so uncommon, affecting just 1 out of every 100,000 people. But there's usually a telltale sign that's visible from birth, a pinkish-purple birthmark on one leg, just like the one Adrien had. With time, the birthmark can thicken and develop painful blisters, another one of Adrien's symptoms, and those blisters were actually Dr. Rosen's main concern, because those blisters were full of infected bodily fluids, which is why the pus that poured out of them smelled so bad. Dr. Rosen paused for a moment before continuing. He said that the infection can spread very quickly throughout the body, and in some cases it can cause high blood pressure or even a stroke and organ damage. Dr. Rosen warned that Adrien's condition was actually so serious that there was a chance the KTS could actually kill him, and unfortunately there was no cure. Adrien's heart raced as Dr. Rosen told him that he now had an almost impossible decision that he would have to make. He said that Adrien could continue to just live with his KTS, risking his life daily, or he could undergo a surgery that he would only have a 50% chance of surviving. In October of 2009, Adrien was wheeled into surgery. Adrien had weighed the pros and cons out, and as terrifying as it was, he knew his only chance at a happy, normal life was to risk the operation, which was a very complicated leg amputation. The procedure took 12 hours, but Adrien did survive, and the surgery was a success. Once Adrien recovered, he returned to school in a wheelchair. He was 150 pounds lighter, and it felt like he was floating through the halls. He finished out his junior year with straight A's and spent the summer adjusting to his new life. And without his leg holding him back, Adrien blossomed in other ways too. He grew more confident, and he rebuilt the social life that he'd lost. And Adrien was so grateful to the adults who didn't give up on him, and he and Mr. Perez stayed really good friends. He went on to attend the University of Texas at El Paso, and in 2019, he graduated with 2 degrees in computer science and business. On the night of May 31st, 2003, 37-year-old Sandy Razzo stood behind the bar at the Green Iguana Bar and Grill, not far from the beach in Rocky Point, Florida. The summer crowds had already started arriving in waves to the area, and so the place that night was totally packed. Music was blaring, people were dancing and shouting, and the line at the bar just kept getting longer. Sandy saw a man wave her down, so she walked over to him, she leaned across the bar so she could hear his order over the music, and then she smiled. And Sandy's smile showed off her perfect teeth that seemed even whiter than they really were because of her very bronze-tanned skin. She also had long hair with blonde highlights and the body of someone who worked out all the time. And when she was younger, Sandy had worked as a fitness model, and she still had dreams of becoming a movie star someday. Because of her looks, men at the bar often made it a point to order their drinks from Sandy instead of one of the other bartenders, and the men almost always told her how pretty she was. And that night was no different. Sandy poured the man his drink and slid it across the bar to him, and right away he told her she was totally beautiful and he left her a great tip. Sandy smiled again and then moved on to the next customer. Sandy used to love all the attention she got from men at the bar, but over the last year or so, she had stopped trusting people, especially men, like she used to. So she had started to keep her guard up a little more at work. For most of her life, Sandy had always thought the best of people, and she believed that when you treated others with kindness, they would do the same to you. But that had all changed for Sandy about a year earlier, after she'd had a horrible experience with a man who she thought was one of her best friends. That man, Tracy Humphrey, had been a part-time bouncer at the last place Sandy had worked as a bartender. Tracy was this big 6'2" tall, bald guy who looked like a big weightlifter. He was actually known as Mr. Clean because he looked like the big bulky guy on the labels of Mr. Clean cleaning products. Tracy and Sandy had first bonded over their love of fitness, and when Sandy found out Tracy worked as a trainer at a gym, she had started taking classes from him. Sandy also loved that Tracy had connections to Hollywood. He claimed he'd been the stunt double for the action movie star Vin Diesel, and that he had worked as Tom Cruise's personal bodyguard. And when Sandy would tell her friends that she still dreamed of acting in movies someday, Tracy was one of the only ones who told her that her dream really could still come true. And so Sandy had hoped that she and Tracy would be friends forever because they got along so well and he supported her dreams and she always felt relaxed and safe with him. But then, one night, when they had been hanging out at Sandy's place, Tracy had tried to pressure Sandy into having sex with him. Sandy got upset and said that was not what she wanted, and she made that clear to Tracy. But when Sandy turned him down, Tracy had gotten angry and gone into a rage. And so, soon after that incident, Sandy had left that job and started working instead at the Green Iguana, so she wouldn't have to see Tracy anymore at work. But even after she had quit, Tracy had kept calling her and bothering her. But by May of 2003, the calls had finally stopped. Sandy heard a rumor that Tracy had started dating a 20-year-old woman named Ashley, so she thought maybe that meant he would leave her alone for good. From behind the bar at the Green Iguana, Sandy could see the crowd was finally starting to thin out. Her feet were aching from standing up all night, and she was excited her shift was ending and she could finally go home. A little while later, she checked in with her manager to say she was leaving, she counted her tips for the night, and then walked through the kitchen towards the back of the building. While Sandy was getting ready to leave, people outside were making their way from one bar to the next, and music was pumping from dance clubs and from parties all across the beach nearby. But a short, bearded man wearing baggy jeans, a sweatshirt, and a baseball cap blocked out all that noise and walked straight down the sidewalk in front of the Green Iguana. The bearded man pushed his way through a crowd of people and then headed around the building to the large parking lot in back. Once the bearded man got to the parking lot, he climbed into his Volkswagen Beetle car and closed the door. Then he leaned over to the back seat and grabbed a rifle that he'd stashed there. Then the bearded man picked up a pair of old jeans on the passenger seat and slid the barrel of the rifle through one of the pant legs to conceal the barrel when he raised the gun. The bearded man lowered the passenger side window, stretched across the car, and propped the now concealed barrel of the rifle on the open window, and then watched patiently at the back door of the Green Iguana. It was hot in the car and he could feel sweat dripping down his forehead from under his hat, but he just kept on focusing on that back door. Then finally, Sandy, who had just finished her shift, came out the back door. As soon as the bearded man saw her, he raised his rifle up and aimed it right at her and fired. The bearded man heard glass break and he saw Sandy look around wildly around the parking lot. The bearded man was confused for a second, but then he realized he hadn't hit Sandy. He had missed. He'd shot the side mirror on his own car. The bearded man panicked and looked around to see if anyone had seen him. Then he tossed the rifle into the back seat, started up his car, and sped off. Back in the parking lot, Sandy got into her black BMW convertible like nothing had happened. She'd heard the glass break, and she'd heard the shot most likely, and the car speeding off, but she just kind of figured that maybe some drunk guy had smashed a bottle somewhere and then driven away. She didn't realize she had been shot at. So, inside of her car, Sandy started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed home. And after about a 25-minute drive, Sandy arrived in her quiet, well-lit neighborhood and pulled up to the 2-story townhouse she shared with her friend, Tony Ponycall. Then she parked her car in the garage and went inside. Tony got home not too long after her, and they both stayed up for a bit talking, and then eventually Sandy went up to bed and fell asleep, not realizing that earlier that night, someone had tried to kill her. The following month, Sandy spent most of her time at work or hanging out with her friends, and she was having fun and making good money, and she felt like her life was moving in a really positive direction. But as good as things were going for her, she'd started to worry a little bit about Tony, the man she lived with. It had become clear to Sandy that Tony was in love with her, and he wanted to be more than just roommates. And Sandy admitted to some of her friends that she kind of liked Tony too. He was sweet, he worked hard, and he treated Sandy like a queen. And the two of them had even gone on a few dates. But after what had happened to Sandy with Tracy, she still wasn't ready to fully trust anyone. And so Sandy had told Tony that she didn't want to have a serious relationship with him and that they were great as friends and roommates, but they should both be able to date whoever else they wanted. Tony said he understood, but there were still times he acted like they were a couple, and that concerned Sandy. On July 5th, over a month after the secret failed shooting in the parking lot, Tony and Sandy hung out for a little while at their townhouse before Sandy left for work. And when she left, Tony told her to have a great day and everything seemed good between them. And Sandy hoped Tony was finally okay with just being friends and roommates again. And when Sandy got to work, any thoughts about Tony quickly disappeared because the bar was so crowded that all she could think about was the next drink she had to make. July 4th weekend at the bar made other summer weekends look tame in comparison. And Sandy could feel her legs burning and her back aching as she made her way up and down the bar pouring drinks for what seemed like a never-ending line of customers. But even though she was tired and busy, she was still in a great mood because everyone was making a lot of money that night and all of the customers seemed like they were really having a great time. And then, after working non-stop for hours, Sandy's shift ended at about 10:30 p.m. So she counted up her tips, she said goodnight to everybody, walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the parking lot. And when Sandy stepped outside, she immediately heard a loud bang! And right away, Sandy was startled, but then she looked up and saw it was just fireworks exploding over the beach. Sandy smiled, climbed into her car, and headed home. And a little after 11 p.m. that night, Sandy pulled onto her street that was lined with small homes and townhouses just like hers, and she noticed how quiet everything was. She figured everybody must still be out, or they must have gone to bed early after partying the day before on July 4th. Sandy pulled into her driveway, she opened her garage door, and parked her car inside of the garage. She turned off her car's engine, pulled her keys out of the ignition, and leaned over to grab her purse on the passenger seat. But while she was leaning over, she heard something slam against the driver's side window. Sandy turned to see what had made the noise, and a look of fear came across her face. Then Sandy screamed, raised her feet up, and began kicking the driver's side door over and over and over. A few minutes after Sandy had gotten home, her roommate, Tony, flipped on the light in their kitchen. Tony was tan with short brown hair, and he was only wearing boxer shorts. He'd expected Sandy to stay out late that night, so he'd gone up to bed. But when he heard something going on in their garage, he headed back downstairs to see if Sandy had gotten home. So Tony walked across their kitchen and opened the door that led out to the garage, and he saw Sandy's black BMW parked right there. But he didn't see Sandy in the car. Tony shouted her name in case maybe she was outside out front of their property, but she didn't yell back. So Tony took a few steps into the garage towards Sandy's car. Then he leaned forward and looked in through the passenger side window, and right away his breath caught in his chest. In the car, Tony saw Sandy lying slumped over the center console, and her car seats were covered in blood. Immediately, Tony ran around to the driver's side of the car, and as he did, he felt glass pierce his bare feet, and he saw the driver's side window was shattered. Tony shook off the pain in his feet, he opened the door and climbed inside. He pulled Sandy into his arms and tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive. Then Tony reached into Sandy's jean pocket, grabbed her cell phone, and dialed 911. The emergency operator picked up, and right away, a look of complete calm suddenly came across Tony's face. And when the operator asked him what was wrong, Tony said in a slow, steady voice that his girlfriend was bleeding in her car and he couldn't wake her up. At about 11:30 p.m., 15 minutes after Tony had made that 911 call, Detective Scott Golcheski of the Pinellas Park Police Department was sitting on the couch at his house when his cell phone rang. Ski, as everybody called Detective Golcheski, had spent a relaxing weekend celebrating the 4th of July. But as soon as he heard his phone ring late at night, he knew his relaxing weekend had just come to an end. Ski answered the phone and had a quick conversation with his boss. And a few minutes later, he was on the road heading to Sandy's townhouse. As Ski drove through the neighborhood and turned onto Sandy's street, he was a little surprised this was the call he'd gotten. On a holiday weekend, his first thought had been that maybe something had happened in the part of town where a bunch of people were drinking at the clubs and bars. But when he parked in front of Sandy's townhouse on her quiet street, he figured he was most likely dealing with a domestic dispute that had turned violent. Ski stepped out of his car and walked up Sandy's driveway. He was in his late 30s, and he was average height with broad shoulders and short brown hair. He'd lived in Florida for years, but he'd grown up in New York and had never lost his New York accent. Ski heard one of the officers who was already on the scene call out his name, so he walked towards them in the garage and saw Sandy's black BMW. Glass from the shattered driver's side window was all over the ground, and Ski saw bloody prints from someone's bare feet. And when he looked in the car, he saw the seats and floorboards were spattered with blood. The officer who had called him over told Ski that a woman in her 30s, Sandy Razzo, had been shot in her car. The victim had been rushed to the hospital, but she had been pronounced dead not long after her arrival. Ski asked who had called 911, and the officer said Sandy's boyfriend. And he also said a cop at the hospital told him that the boyfriend had followed the ambulance to the hospital in his own car before police had arrived at the townhouse. Ski made a mental note of that. There was nothing strange about a boyfriend rushing off to the hospital where his girlfriend had been shot, but police must have been very close behind the ambulance, and so he wondered if maybe the boyfriend had wanted to get away before having to face the cops. Then, a ballistics expert on the scene walked over to Ski and pointed out where they had found multiple shell casings in the car and in the garage. And Ski realized that whoever had shot Sandy made little or no effort to cover their tracks. And Ski thought that could indicate one of two things. Someone had either seen the shooter in the act, and so the shooter had panicked and ran, or the shooter had very little experience with firearms and didn't understand all the evidence a gun could leave behind. Ski wanted to test out his first theory and see if anyone had caught the shooter in the act, so he and a few other officers started going door to door in the neighborhood to ask questions. But Sandy's neighbors had either been out when the attack took place, or they had already gone to bed, and so nobody had heard or seen a thing. So after canvassing the neighborhood, Ski went back to Sandy's townhouse. He and the other officers had already been in there for hours, but he told himself he wasn't going to sleep until he was sure they had found every piece of evidence possible at the crime scene. By 6:30 a.m. on July 6th, so about 7 hours after Ski had gotten the call from his boss, Ski was still at Sandy's townhouse. He was out on the driveway, making sure they hadn't missed any tire tracks or any other evidence out there, and as he did that, he looked up and saw the sun rising, and that was when he realized how tired he was. But just then, a Toyota 4Runner vehicle pulled up in front of the townhouse, and a man stepped out of the car and started walking towards Ski, and Ski immediately felt a jolt of energy. The man introduced himself as Tony Ponycall, the victim's boyfriend. He was now wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, and he said he'd spoken to officers at the hospital and they had let him go. And so he wanted to come back home to see if he could help the police who were there. Ski was shocked at how calm Tony seemed. His girlfriend had just been shot and killed, and he showed up at the scene of the crime like he was there to just help them find a missing dog or something. But Ski knew shock affected people differently, so he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Ski asked Tony if they could go inside and talk through the events of the previous evening. Tony smiled and said he'd be happy to help. And as they walked across the yard towards the front door, Ski noticed there were scratches on Tony's hands and arms. Once they were inside, Tony led Ski through a foyer with peach-colored tile floors and into a living room with a high ceiling. Tony sat down on the couch, and Ski sat in a chair across from him. Police had found no evidence of forced entry in the house, and Tony said nobody other than him had come into the house that night. Then, with an almost blank look on his face, Tony said he'd been in the upstairs bedroom when he heard something going on in the garage, so he went downstairs to see if maybe Sandy had gotten home, and he told Ski about how he had found Sandy slumped over in her car. But even when talking about the moment he had found Sandy with blood all over her face and clothes and all over the car, Tony remained completely calm. So, Ski leaned in a bit closer and asked Tony if he and Sandy's relationship was serious or more like casual dating. And Tony said Sandy was actually his fiancée. A confused look came across Ski's face, and he pointed out that Tony had just introduced himself as Sandy's boyfriend. But Tony quickly said that he just hadn't gotten used to being engaged yet. Ski nodded, but watched Tony's face closely to see if he looked like he might be lying, but Tony's appearance never changed. So, Ski pointed at Tony's hands and arms and asked him how he'd gotten all those cuts. Tony said when he climbed into the car to try to revive Sandy, he'd cut his arms and his hands on the shattered glass. And he also said he had not been wearing shoes or socks at the time, and he'd cut his bare feet as well on the glass on the ground. And when he said this, Ski figured that probably cleared up who those bloody footprints belonged to. Then finally, Ski looked Tony in the eye and asked him if he could think of anyone who might want to harm or kill Sandy. And for the first time, Tony's calm, cool demeanor disappeared. His face started to turn red, he clenched his jaw, and then he said there was one person who definitely could have killed Sandy. And that guy was a guy they called Mr. Clean, Tracy Humphrey. In his time as a detective, Ski had tried to stick to a simple rule: never get tunnel vision when working a case. Over the years, he'd seen a lot of cops build cases entirely around one suspect, and when that suspect turned out to be innocent, the cases just fell apart. So, in the days following Sandy's murder, Ski still definitely considered Tony to be a major suspect. Tony was the one who had found Sandy and called 911, and he had those scratches on his hands and arms. And on the day after the murder, Ski had heard from one of Sandy's coworkers at the Green Iguana that Sandy had never agreed to marry Tony, and she'd actually told him she didn't want a serious relationship with him at all. So Tony calling Sandy his fiancée just seemed totally strange to Ski. But Tony had undergone a gunpowder residue test to determine if he'd recently fired a gun, he had willingly submitted DNA samples, and he had allowed the forensics team to do a thorough investigation of his car. And so, while the investigators waited for all those test results to come back, Ski started looking into other possible suspects. And someone who worked at the Green Iguana had seen a bearded man kind of lurking outside the night Sandy was killed, but they had no idea who he was. So Ski now had Tony and this unknown bearded guy as possible suspects, but for the time, he wanted to turn his attention to Tracy Humphrey, aka Mr. Clean, the man who Tony was so sure could be Sandy's killer. So, at 3 p.m. on July 8th, less than 3 days after Sandy's murder, Ski paid a visit to the gym where Tracy worked as an instructor and personal trainer. Ski walked into the gym and heard the sound of trainers shouting encouragement and people grunting while they lifted weights. Then he walked up to the front desk, showed the man behind the counter his badge, and asked to speak with Tracy. The employee said he would go get Tracy and pointed Ski to a small office where he could have some privacy. Ski thanked the man and then walked into the office, took a seat at a table with nothing on it, and waited. And a couple of minutes later, Tracy walked in. He was 36 years old, out of breath, dripping with sweat, and had a towel wrapped around his neck. Ski was taken aback by how big and intimidating this guy was. Ski asked Tracy to close the door behind him and have a seat. So Tracy closed the door, he wiped the sweat from his face with his towel, and then he sat down. Then he introduced himself to Ski in a low, soft voice. And right away, Ski thought that Tracy's voice didn't really match his body. Ski smiled and said he knew Tracy was working, so he wouldn't take up much of his time. Then he asked if Tracy had heard about what happened to his friend Sandy. Tracy said he'd read about it in the newspaper and that he was totally heartbroken. Ski told Tracy that he was very sorry for his loss because Ski believed that it was always a good idea to start a line of questioning by empathizing. But before Ski could actually ask a follow-up question, Tracy suddenly stood up and said he did not feel comfortable talking to police at work, and that if Ski had a problem with that, he could contact Tracy's lawyer. Ski was surprised the conversation had taken such a quick turn, and it definitely made him question why Tracy wanted to get out of there so fast. But he didn't have anything to charge Tracy with, so he just thanked Tracy for his time, stepped out of the office, and walked back through the gym. And when Ski stepped outside, right away he felt the sun on his face and a warm breeze blowing. The temperature was about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and Ski thought that this was the perfect kind of summer day to go to the beach. And right there, it struck him that Sandy would never get to enjoy these perfect summer days in Florida ever again because someone had robbed her of her future. And that made Ski very angry. He wanted to find Sandy's killer as fast as he could. And the conversation he just had inside the gym made him want to dig a lot deeper into Tracy's life. Over the following week, Ski and the investigative team returned to Sandy's townhouse multiple times to see if any new evidence had emerged, and they also followed up with Sandy's coworkers to see if they remembered something from the night of Sandy's murder that they might have overlooked the first time they were interviewed. But nothing new surfaced. So during that time, Ski also did something that some other detectives might not have done. Ski's father had been a fireman, and so Ski had always admired firefighters and had close relationships with a lot of them in the area. And so he reached out to friends at different local fire departments, filled them in on the Sandy Rozzo case, and asked them to please let him know if they had anything that might help him find Sandy's killer and bring them to justice. Ski didn't know if anything would come of asking these firemen for help, but it just made sense to him to use all the resources at his disposal. But as the days passed, no new evidence came in from anywhere, and so Ski started to really get frustrated. And he wanted to move the investigation forward, but he'd run into a big problem. Tracy's lawyer had told Tracy not to say another word to police about Sandy's murder. And that was a major roadblock for Ski, because even if Tracy hadn't killed Sandy, the police couldn't rule him out if they didn't get any information from him. But Ski refused to let this lawyer bring his investigation to a stop, so he came up with a plan to work around Tracy. Ski had learned that Tracy recently married a 20-year-old woman named Ashley who worked with him at the gym. So he figured if he couldn't talk to Tracy, maybe he could talk to Tracy's new wife. But Ski wanted to make sure Ashley was alone when he met with her, because if Tracy was there, Ashley almost certainly would be told not to talk. So at around 3 p.m. on July 16th, 11 days after Sandy's murder, Ski drove to the gym where Tracy and Ashley worked and parked right outside. Then he stepped out of his car and walked right up to the large windows out front and pressed his face up to the glass to look inside. But he couldn't see if Tracy or Ashley were in the gym or not. So Ski went inside, walked up to the employee he'd met there the last time, and asked if Tracy was working. The man said he was, but that he'd just started teaching a class. So Ski asked if Ashley was working, and the man said no, she had the day off. And that was all Ski needed to hear. He turned around, rushed out of the gym, and ran to his car. He knew he was in a race now. As soon as Tracy finished his class and found out a cop had been looking for him and Ashley, Tracy would call his wife to tell her not to talk. So Ski got in his car, started the engine, peeled out, and sped off down the street. And about 10 minutes later, after speeding across town, Ski hit the brakes and parked his car in front of the apartment building where Tracy and Ashley lived. He took a deep breath, calmed himself down, and then got out of the car and walked to their apartment. After knocking on the door opened, and it was Ashley. Ashley was pretty with long brown curly hair and big eyes, and she was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. Ski showed her his badge and asked if he could come inside and talk for a bit. Ashley shifted back and forth on her feet, and she had a nervous look on her face, but she said okay. Ashley closed the door behind them and then led Ski to their living room. Ashley walked around a wooden coffee table and sat down on the couch, and Ski took a seat in a nearby chair. Once they were seated, Ski asked her how long she'd been married to Tracy, and Ashley said they'd actually just gotten married on July 4th at the gym where they worked. Ski smiled and said it must have been nice to have a wedding on a holiday with fireworks going off all night. Then Ski asked her if she and her new husband had gone on a honeymoon right after their wedding. But Ashley laughed and said the following night, July 5th, they just rented some movies, ordered pizza, and just hung out on the couch. Ashley shifted her position on the couch and asked what this was all about. But Ski just kept on smiling and asked where they had rented the movies and gotten pizza from. And Ashley gave him the name of the video store and the pizza place. Then Ashley's cell phone, which was sitting on the coffee table, started to ring. She sat up straight and looked at the phone and then asked Ski if she could answer it, and Ski said, of course, it was her phone. So Ashley grabbed the phone, walked into the kitchen, and answered the call. And when Ski heard her talking from the other room, he knew it was Tracy on the other line and that getting any more information out of Ashley was going to be impossible. But Ski kept on smiling because he'd gotten what he'd came for. Ashley had just given Tracy an alibi for the night of the murder, and now Ski just had to follow up on it. So after Ashley hung up and came back into the living room, Ski immediately just thanked her for her help and then walked outside to his car. And not long after that, he drove to the video store that Ashley had mentioned. And an employee there pulled up Tracy's rental history and showed Ski that Tracy had indeed rented movies a few hours before Sandy had been murdered. After that, Ski drove to the pizza place that Ashley said they'd ordered from, and one of the pizza delivery drivers there pulled up their records on their computer, and the records showed that Tracy had ordered pizza less than an hour before Sandy's murder. And then the delivery driver told Ski that he remembered delivering that pizza to a tall, big, bald guy a little after 11 p.m. on July 5th, almost the exact time Sandy had been killed. Ski thanked the pizza delivery guy and then went back outside, got into his car, and headed for the police station. And as he drove, he felt like even though this was great information, it was like he had hit a big dead end. Tracy's simple alibi, that he was at home eating pizza, looked like it was the truth. And so Ski wondered if maybe he needed to take his focus off of Tracy for a while and turn it back to Sandy's roommate, Tony. But then, on the following day, Ski got a call from one of the people he'd spoken to at the Tampa Fire Department, and they said they'd found something in an arson case of theirs that they thought might be connected to Sandy's murder. And what the fire department told Ski would put his investigation right back on track, and it would lead him directly to the bearded man who had tried to shoot Sandy in the Green Iguana parking lot. Based on the report that Ski received from the fire department, evidence found at the crime scene, and information gathered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Sandy on July 5th, 2003. A little after 10:30 p.m. on July 5th, Sandy's killer had fallen asleep in a compact rental car in the Green Iguana parking lot. The killer was wearing a baseball cap pulled down low just above their eyes, and the thick sweatshirt and pants they were wearing had caused them to get so hot inside of the car that they dozed off for a few minutes. But then the sound of a car door slamming nearby had woken them up. They looked out the windshield and saw Sandy driving off in her black BMW. The killer immediately sat up straight and yelled out in frustration and then slammed their hands down on the steering wheel. The killer had intended to shoot Sandy right there in the parking lot, but now that wasn't an option. So the killer glanced over and looked at their Ruger .22 caliber pistol on the passenger seat, and then they started the car and pulled out onto the street behind Sandy's BMW. The killer still felt a little out of it from having fallen asleep, and their hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, but they managed to weave their way through holiday weekend traffic and keep up with Sandy's car. Then, after about 25 minutes, the killer followed Sandy as she turned off a main road into her neighborhood. The killer eased off the gas to make sure they didn't get too close to Sandy's car. The killer saw Sandy pull into her driveway, open the garage door, and park her BMW inside of the garage. So the killer pulled the rental car right up to the curb in front of Sandy's townhouse. Then, with their heart pounding in anticipation, the killer wiped the sweat from their eyes, they grabbed the pistol off the passenger seat, opened the car door, and ran up the driveway into the garage. Once the killer was inside, they saw Sandy leaning over the passenger seat to grab her purse. So the killer ran up to the driver's side, raised the pistol, and slammed the butt of it into the window and held their hand up to shield their eyes from the glass. But they didn't break the window. Instead, the killer looked down and saw the glass intact, and inside the vehicle, Sandy had heard the sound, whipped herself around, and was looking up at them with a look of fear and confusion on her face. Then Sandy began screaming, and she raised her foot and began kicking the driver's side door over and over again, trying to open it to maybe slam into the killer. But the door didn't open, and Sandy just kept on kicking. Meanwhile, the killer could feel every muscle in their body start to tense up, and more sweat dripped down their face and neck, and their chest started to feel tight, and in a panic, the killer just raised their gun right up to the window and fired into the car. The window shattered and glass flew at the killer, but they kept on firing over and over again until they had unloaded all 8 rounds into the car. Inside the BMW, Sandy was bleeding from her torso, her foot, her head. Blood covered her face and clothes and was spattered on the car seats and floorboards. She was choking, her vision was fading, and she was struggling to breathe. Then everything went black, and Sandy slumped over the center console. After looking inside the car and making sure Sandy was motionless, the killer turned and ran out of the garage, back down the driveway, got into their rental car, and once inside, they took a deep breath and put the pistol back on the passenger seat, right next to the fake beard they had been wearing earlier that night. It would turn out the short, bearded man who had failed to kill Sandy in May when they had fired at her coming out of the bar and missed, and then had successfully killed Sandy on July 5th, was really a woman in disguise. It was Ashley Humphrey, Tracy's new wife. And on both occasions, Ashley had disguised herself as a man by wearing baggy jeans, a big sweatshirt, a baseball cap pulled down low, and a cheap fake beard. And she had made a point to be seen looking like a man by other people outside the Green Iguana, which is why she was kind of lurking around. She wanted to be seen. But on the night of the actual murder, Ashley, who had been wearing the beard, had been sweating so much that she had removed it when she'd actually gone inside the garage to kill Sandy. And it was the call from the Tampa Fire Department that actually led Ski back to Ashley almost right after he had thought about moving on from her and her husband. On the night of Ashley's failed murder attempt on Sandy back in May, she had accidentally shot her own car's side mirror, and Ashley had worried that the bullet hole in her mirror would eventually attract police attention. So, in a total panic, Ashley had driven her Volkswagen Beetle with the shot-up side view mirror to a vacant lot and then set it on fire. And when the fire department investigated what they believed was a case of arson, they had traced the burned Volkswagen back to Ashley. And then, when they had talked to Ski about this, they realized that Ashley was in a relationship with Tracy Humphrey, who was one of Ski's major suspects. And so, Ashley was ultimately arrested, and she confessed to killing Sandy. But the case didn't end there. Leading up to Ashley's trial, she cooperated with police, and she said Tracy had threatened her with violence in order to force her to murder Sandy. And she said Tracy had even made her marry him the night before the murder because spouses cannot be forced to testify against each other in court. And it would turn out that Tracy had a clear motive for wanting to kill Sandy, because the fight he had had with Sandy when she refused to have sex with him had actually been far worse than most of Sandy's friends knew. On that night, after Tracy had flown into a rage, he had beaten Sandy and raped her. and eventually Sandy had filed charges against Tracy, and his trial was set to start in August of 2003. So he had gotten Ashley to kill Sandy so the state wouldn't have a witness to prove the allegations against him, and the trial would just go away. Despite Tony Ponycall's odd decision to call Sandy his girlfriend and then also his fiancée when talking to police, along with his weirdly calm behavior in the immediate aftermath of Sandy's murder, he was not actually in any way connected to her death. Ashley was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison and is scheduled for release in 2028. As for Tracy, in the lead-up to his murder trial, several women stepped forward and shared their own stories about how he had also abused them. Tracy was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Too long, too afraid to leave, chasing shadows of what I couldn't believe. Every word you said cut sharper than glass, but I stayed in the storm, letting moments pass. I lost my smile, I lost my nights, wrapped up in your wrongs, ignoring my rights. But now I see I can breathe again. No more echoes of your lies, no more pain, I'm not broken. I just found the strength to open door after door I left locked inside. I'm stepping out, leaving the touch.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on YouTube.